The soft hum of fluorescent lights filled the halls of Gracewood General Hospital, casting long shadows on the pristine white walls. Angela Marshall tightened her grip on her leather satchel as she took her first steps into the building. The click of her modest black shoes echoed through the hallway, an unintentional announcement of her presence. The air smelled of antiseptic, sharp and sterile, but it was the underlying tension that made Angela's stomach twist. This was her first day as the newest nurse at Gracewood, a place renowned for its state-of-the-art facilities and impeccable reputation. Yet beneath its polished exterior, whispers of a toxic culture had reached Angela's ears during her training. She had dismissed them as mere rumors, but now, walking through the maze of corridors, she could feel an undercurrent of unease. As Angela approached the nurse's station, her nerves buzzed with anticipation. She adjusted the gold pin on her chest that bore her name and title, Angela Marshall, RN. At the desk, a group of nurses chatted quietly, their laughter ceasing as soon as they noticed her. Conversations trailed off, replaced by a wall of polite, yet cold stares. "Excuse me," Angela said, forcing a smile. Her voice carried a natural warmth, but the icy reception chipped away at her confidence. "I'm Angela Marshall, the new hire. Could someone point me to the head nurse's office?" A young nurse with perfectly curled blonde hair looked up from her clipboard. Her expression wavered between politeness and disdain, the latter winning out as she motioned down the hall. "Third door on the left." "Thank you," Angela said, clutching her bag tighter as she walked away. She resisted the urge to glance back, though the weight of their stares pressed heavy against her back. The head nurse's office was small, but meticulously organized, every paper and pen in its designated place. Behind the desk sat Miriam Harper, a woman in her late 50s with sharp eyes and an even sharper tone. "Miss Marshall," Miriam greeted her, not bothering to rise. Her eyes flicked over Angela, appraising her from head to toe. "You're punctual. That's a good start. But let me be clear, this hospital has high standards. We don't tolerate mediocrity. Understood?" Angela nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Understood, ma'am." The rest of the day was a blur of orientations and introductions. Angela tried to focus on learning the protocols, but she couldn't ignore the subtle microaggressions she encountered. Her colleagues were polite but distant, their smiles not quite reaching their eyes. By the end of her shift, Angela felt a bone-deep exhaustion that had little to do with physical exertion. Sitting alone in the break room, she pulled out her phone and dialed her mother's number. As soon as she heard her mother's voice, the emotions she had been holding back all day came rushing to the surface. "Hey, baby girl," her mother said, her tone filled with warmth. "How was your first day?" "It was." Angela hesitated, searching for the right words. "It was challenging." Her mother didn't miss a beat. "Angela Marie, you listen to me. You've worked too hard to let anyone make you feel less than. You belong there, just as much as anyone else." Angela smiled despite herself. "Thanks, Mom. I needed that." The next morning, Angela resolved to prove herself. She walked into Gracewood with her head held high, ready to face whatever the day had in store. Little did she know, her journey was about to take an unexpected turn. That day she would meet a patient whose presence would unravel secrets, ignite confrontations, and force the hospital to reckon with its deepest flaws. Angela's second day at Gracewood began with the usual morning bustle of the hospital. Nurses and doctors moved quickly through the corridors, clipboards in hand, voices low but hurried. Angela had just finished her rounds when she was summoned by the head nurse to room 314. "We've got a new patient," Miriam Harper said curtly, handing Angela a chart. "Thomas Grayson. Skiing accident. 2 broken ribs, mild concussion. He's a high-profile case, so keep everything by the book." Angela scanned the chart, noting the name. Thomas Grayson, a name she recognized from the headlines. He was a prominent business tycoon, known for his investments in real estate and philanthropy. The kind of patient whose opinion carried weight and whose care could influence reputations. Angela knocked softly before entering the room. Inside, a man in his mid-60s sat upright in the hospital bed, his graying hair neatly combed. Despite the bruises on his face and the bandage around his chest, he exuded an air of authority. "Good morning, Mr. Grayson," Angela said, her tone professional yet kind. "I'm Nurse Marshall, and I'll be taking care of you during your stay." Grayson looked up from the tablet in his hands, his sharp eyes meeting hers. "Good morning, Nurse Marshall. I appreciate your attentiveness." Angela began her routine checks, noting his vitals and ensuring his IV line was properly secured. Grayson's gaze lingered on her, his expression thoughtful. "You're new here, aren't you?" he asked. Angela smiled faintly. "Yes, sir. Just started this week." Grayson nodded. "And how are you finding Gracewood so far?" Angela hesitated, unsure how much to share. "It's an adjustment." Grayson chuckled softly. "That's a diplomatic answer. I can respect that." Over the next few days, Angela found herself assigned to Grayson more often than any other nurse. Their interactions were professional but increasingly cordial. Grayson, despite his injuries, maintained a sharp wit and a curious mind. He often asked Angela about her background, her aspirations, and her experiences at the hospital. At first, Angela kept her answers brief, wary of overstepping professional boundaries. But there was something about Grayson's demeanor that put her at ease. One afternoon, as she adjusted the pillows behind his back, he said, "You strike me as someone who doesn't back down from a challenge." Angela paused, surprised. "I try not to," she admitted. Grayson smiled faintly. "Good. It's a rare quality these days." Despite her growing rapport with Grayson, Angela's days at Gracewood remained fraught with tension. Dr. Emily Carter, a senior physician, had taken a particular interest in undermining her at every turn. Dr. Carter's criticisms were subtle but cutting, often delivered in front of other staff members. During one particularly busy shift, Angela was called to assist Dr. Carter during a procedure. The patient, a middle-aged woman with a severe laceration, required stitches. Angela worked quickly and efficiently, anticipating Dr. Carter's needs. "Clamp," Dr. Carter demanded, holding out her hand. Angela placed the clamp in her hand without hesitation. But as the procedure continued, Dr. Carter's tone grew sharper. "Pay attention, Nurse Marshall," she snapped. "You're slowing me down." Angela bit her tongue, focusing on her tasks. When the procedure was finally over, Dr. Carter turned to her with a scowl. "If you want to succeed here, you'll need to be quicker on your feet. This isn't nursing school." Angela clenched her jaw, the sting of the words cutting deep. She knew she had done everything correctly, but challenging a senior physician in front of her peers felt like a losing battle. Later that evening, Angela found herself back in Grayson's room, her shoulders heavy with frustration. "You look tired," Grayson observed as she adjusted his IV. "Rough day?" Angela hesitated before nodding. "It's been challenging." Grayson studied her for a moment before speaking. "Nurse Marshall, I've built my career on understanding people, what drives them, what scares them, and I can tell that you're dealing with more than just the usual pressures of this job." Angela's hands stilled, her heart pounding. "I'm not sure what you mean, sir." Grayson leaned back against the pillows, his gaze piercing. "You're a capable nurse, but I can see the way some of the staff treat you. The subtle dismissals, the pointed remarks, it's unacceptable." Angela felt a lump rise in her throat. She had grown so accustomed to brushing off the microaggressions that hearing someone acknowledge them felt both validating and overwhelming. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Grayson," she said softly. "But I'm here to do my job, not to make waves." Grayson's expression hardened. "Sometimes, doing your job means standing up for yourself. You don't have to fight this battle alone." Angela nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed him. The hospital's culture felt too entrenched, too resistant to change. But as she left Grayson's room that night, his words lingered in her mind. The next morning, Angela arrived at Gracewood with a renewed determination to carry herself with grace and professionalism, despite the challenges she faced. As she clocked in and reviewed her assignments for the day, her name once again appeared next to Thomas Grayson's room. She couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and apprehension. Grayson's keen observations often brought her comfort, but also reminded her of the silent battles she fought daily. By mid-morning, the tension in the hospital seemed more palpable than usual. Nurses whispered in hushed tones about an important meeting scheduled later in the day. Angela brushed off the gossip and focused on her rounds. When she entered Grayson's room, she was surprised to find him sitting up, a laptop balanced precariously on his knees. "Mr. Grayson," she said, raising an eyebrow, "you're supposed to be resting." Grayson looked up with a faint smile. Resting is overrated, Nurse Marshall. Besides, I have work to do. Angela shook her head, stepping forward to adjust his pillows. And what kind of work can't wait until you're fully recovered? Grayson's smile deepened, though his tone grew serious. The kind that involves changing a system that's overdue for reform. Angela paused, her hands hovering over the pillow. What do you mean? Grayson closed the laptop and regarded her thoughtfully. Let's just say I've been observing more than just your excellent care during my stay here. There are cracks in this hospital's foundation, and they run deep. It's time someone addressed them. Angela felt her stomach knot. She wanted to ask more, but Grayson's expression suggested that he wasn't ready to share the details. Instead, she resumed her tasks, her mind racing. By the afternoon, rumors about the mysterious meeting had reached a fever pitch. Angela tried to ignore the buzz, focusing on her work, but when she was called to the head nurse's office, her pulse quickened. She knocked hesitantly before stepping inside. Miriam Harper sat behind her desk, her expression unreadable. Nurse Marshall, you've been requested to attend a special briefing in the conference room at 3 p.m. Be punctual. Angela nodded, her heart pounding. May I ask what it's about? You'll find out soon enough, Miriam replied curtly. Dismissed. The conference room was packed by the time Angela arrived. She slipped into a seat near the back, noting the nervous energy that filled the space. Doctors, nurses, and administrative staff murmured among themselves, their voices hushed but tense. At precisely 3 p.m., the doors opened, and a group of individuals entered, led by none other than Thomas Grayson. The room fell silent as he made his way to the front, his commanding presence impossible to ignore. Angela's breath caught in her throat. What was he doing here? Grayson addressed the room, his voice steady and authoritative. Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Thomas Grayson, and I've been a patient at Gracewood for the past week. But my presence here today is about more than my recovery. He paused, scanning the room. During my stay, I've had the opportunity to observe the operations of this hospital closely. And while there is much to commend, dedicated staff, advanced facilities, it's clear that there are systemic issues that need to be addressed. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but Grayson raised a hand, silencing them. Let me be clear, I am not here to criticize without offering solutions. However, my observations, coupled with specific incidents brought to my attention, have highlighted a culture of inequity, unprofessional behavior that cannot be ignored. Angela's heart pounded as Grayson's words sank in. Was he referring to her experiences? The thought both terrified and emboldened her. To address these issues, Grayson continued, I have proposed a series of reforms, starting with the establishment of a Diversity and Inclusion Council, mandatory training programs for all staff, and a transparent reporting system for grievances. The room erupted into whispers, but Grayson pressed on. These changes are not optional. They are essential for Gracewood to continue its reputation as a leader in healthcare. Angela sat frozen, her mind racing. She had never expected someone of Grayson's stature to take such a personal interest in the struggles she faced. As the meeting concluded, staff members filed out, their expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. Angela remained seated, unsure of what to do. Angela, a familiar voice called softly. She looked up to see Grayson approaching her. May I have a word? In the quiet of the now empty conference room, Grayson sat across from Angela, his expression thoughtful. I know this is a lot to take in, he began, but I want you to know that your experiences have been a catalyst for these changes. Angela's breath hitched. Mr. Grayson, I never. You don't have to explain, he interrupted gently. I've seen enough to understand. The way you've handled yourself with grace and professionalism, despite the challenges, speaks volumes. You've inspired me to act. Angela felt a mix of gratitude and disbelief. Thank you, sir, but I'm just one person. And one person can make all the difference, Grayson said firmly. That's why I'd like to involve you in the implementation of these reforms. Your insights and experiences are invaluable. Angela hesitated, the weight of his words sinking in. I don't know if I'm the right person for that kind of responsibility. You are, Grayson said without hesitation. Trust me. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Gracewood began rolling out the proposed changes, and Angela found herself thrust into a leadership role she hadn't anticipated. She worked closely with Grayson and hospital administrators, helping to develop training programs and establish protocols for addressing grievances. The process was far from smooth. Resistance from certain staff members was palpable, and Angela often felt the sting of their resentment. But for every obstacle, there were moments of progress. Colleagues who began to see her in a new light, patients who expressed their gratitude for her care, and small victories that reminded her why she had chosen this profession. One evening, as Angela reviewed documents in her small apartment, her phone buzzed with a message from Grayson. "Keep pushing forward. Change takes time, but it starts with people like you." Angela smiled, the words filling her with renewed determination. For the first time since she began her journey at Gracewood, she felt a sense of purpose, a belief that she could not only endure but also thrive. The tension in the room was palpable as Dr. Greaves paced back and forth in his office, muttering under his breath. Angela could hear snippets of his frustration leaking through the half-closed door as she stood outside, waiting to be called in. He had summoned her abruptly after the latest meeting, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Despite the weight of the moment, Angela felt a quiet resolve within her. She was tired of bending under the strain of injustice. Finally, the door opened. Dr. Greaves gestured for her to enter without meeting her gaze. Angela stepped inside, noting the oppressive silence of the room, broken only by the rhythmic tapping of the doctor's pen against his desk. "Sit," he ordered curtly, gesturing to a chair opposite him. Angela complied, keeping her posture upright and her expression neutral. "I've reviewed the reports from the committee," Dr. Greaves began, his voice tight with barely suppressed irritation. "It seems you've been quite vocal about your grievances." Angela met his gaze steadily. "I've only shared my experiences and advocated for changes that align with the hospital's stated values." Dr. Greaves's lips tightened into a thin line. "While we appreciate feedback, Nurse Parker, you need to understand that institutions like St. Mary's don't change overnight. Pushing too hard can be disruptive." Angela's chest tightened, but she refused to back down. "Change is always disruptive, Dr. Greaves, but it's necessary, especially when lives and careers are at stake." Dr. Greaves' eyes flashed with anger, but before he could respond, there was a knock at the door. A hospital administrator entered, looking uncomfortable but resolute. "Dr. Greaves," she began, her tone formal, "the board has scheduled an emergency meeting. Mr. Edwards has requested your presence." Angela watched as a flicker of unease crossed Dr. Greaves's face. The name alone seemed to shift the power dynamics in the room. Without another word, he stood and left, leaving Angela alone with her thoughts. Meanwhile, in the boardroom, Thomas Edwards sat at the head of the table, his broken arm resting in a sling. Around him, board members shifted nervously, aware of the weight of his presence. Edwards had spent the past week quietly gathering evidence, speaking to staff members, and documenting every instance of discrimination he had witnessed or heard about. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone calm but firm, "I came to St. Mary's as a patient, but what I found was a system plagued by complacency and a culture of exclusion. This is unacceptable." The room fell silent as Edwards presented his findings. He detailed the systemic issues, highlighting specific incidents and naming individuals who perpetuated the toxic culture. As he spoke, Dr. Greaves entered, his face pale and drawn. He took a seat, his usual confidence noticeably absent. Edwards turned his gaze to him. "Dr. Greaves, you've been a central figure in many of the complaints I've reviewed. What do you have to say for yourself?" Dr. Greaves hesitated, clearly unprepared for such direct scrutiny. I've always acted in the best interests of this hospital," he stammered. "Have you?" Edwards countered, his voice sharp. "Because from where I'm sitting, it seems your actions have done more harm than good." The tension in the room was electric, as the board members exchanged uneasy glances. For years, Dr. Greaves had been untouchable, his position cemented by his seniority and connections. But now, with Edwards challenging him so openly, the cracks in his facade were beginning to show. Back in the ward, Angela resumed her duties, trying to focus despite the swirling rumors about the board meeting. Staff members whispered in hushed tones, their curiosity and fear palpable. Some avoided Angela altogether, while others offered tentative smiles, as if sensing the tides were turning. By the time Angela's shift ended, she felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her. As she prepared to leave, her phone buzzed with a message from Edwards. "Tomorrow, everything changes. Be ready." As Angela navigated the bustling halls of St. Mary's the following day, whispers trailed her every move. Her colleagues, once indifferent or outright hostile, now looked at her with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Mr. Edwards's intervention had shaken the hospital to its core, and the cracks in its pristine facade were now impossible to ignore. Angela knew that this newfound attention brought its own challenges. Every interaction felt scrutinized, every decision a test. Still, she carried herself with the quiet confidence instilled in her by years of perseverance and her mother's unwavering belief in her strength. Mid-afternoon, Angela received a summons to meet the hospital administrator, Miss Caldwell, in her office. The sterile white walls of the administrative wing seemed to close in as Angela approached, her footsteps echoing in the corridor. Steeling herself, she knocked firmly and entered at the administrator's invitation. Miss Caldwell sat behind her polished oak desk, her expression a blend of nervousness and resolve. To Angela's surprise, Mr. Edwards was also present, seated in one of the visitors' chairs. He gave her an encouraging nod as she took the seat beside him. "Angela," Miss Caldwell began, folding her hands on the desk. "First, I want to acknowledge the courage you've shown. The past few weeks have been difficult, and I regret that our institution failed to provide the support you deserved." Angela inclined her head, not entirely trusting this sudden shift in tone. Miss Caldwell continued, "We've begun implementing Mr. Edwards' recommendations, starting with a full review of our hiring practices and mandatory diversity training for all staff." Angela glanced at Mr. Edwards, who gave her a slight smile of encouragement. "That's a step in the right direction," Angela said carefully. "But real change will take more than policy updates. It's about culture, how we treat each other every day." Miss Caldwell nodded. "Agreed. Which is why we'd like you to take on a more active role in shaping that culture. Mr. Edwards has proposed creating a Diversity and Inclusion Council, and we'd like you to lead it." The words hung in the air for a moment, their weight settling over Angela like a warm yet heavy blanket. This was an opportunity to effect real change, but it also meant stepping into a highly visible and potentially contentious role. Angela took a deep breath, her gaze shifting from Miss Caldwell to Mr. Edwards. The latter's calm, reassuring expression reminded her of the strength she had demonstrated so far. "I'm honored," Angela said finally, her voice steady, "and I accept. But this council can't be symbolic. It has to drive meaningful change, and I'll need full support from leadership to ensure that happens." Miss Caldwell nodded earnestly. "You have my commitment, Angela. We'll provide the resources you need." Angela turned to Mr. Edwards, her expression firm. "And you'll be involved, I assume?" Mr. Edwards smiled. "Absolutely. I don't plan to let this hospital or any other in our network revert to old habits. I'll be a resource for you every step of the way." Angela nodded, already formulating plans in her mind. "Thank you. Let's get started." The days that followed were a whirlwind of meetings, planning sessions, and discussions with staff. Angela was determined to use her new platform to address not just surface-level issues, but the systemic inequalities that had festered within St. Mary's for years. One of her first actions as the leader of the Diversity and Inclusion Council was to implement an anonymous feedback system, allowing employees to report discrimination or harassment without fear of reprisal. The council also began hosting weekly listening sessions where staff could share their experiences and propose solutions. Unsurprisingly, not everyone welcomed the changes. A small but vocal group of employees, many loyal to Dr. Greaves, resisted the council's initiatives, claiming they were unnecessary or disruptive. During one particularly tense staff meeting, a senior nurse voiced her concerns. "I understand the intent behind these changes," she said, her tone clipped, "but some of us feel like we're being unfairly labeled as part of the problem. It's creating division." Angela met the woman's gaze calmly. "I understand your perspective," she said, her voice measured. "But division already existed here. It was just hidden beneath the surface. Addressing it openly is the only way we can move forward as a team. The nurse's expression softened slightly, though skepticism lingered in her eyes. Angela pressed on. This isn't about assigning blame. It's about creating a space where everyone feels valued and respected. If you have ideas for how we can achieve that, I want to hear them. The meeting ended with a mix of tension and cautious optimism. Angela knew progress would be slow and uneven, but she was committed to the work. Meanwhile, Mr. Edwards continued to support Angela behind the scenes, using his influence to ensure the council's initiatives received the necessary funding and attention. His presence at the hospital, once a source of mystery, had become a symbol of accountability and hope for many employees. One afternoon, as Angela reviewed proposals for new training programs, Mr. Edwards stopped by her office. "How's it going?" he asked, leaning casually against the doorframe. Angela smiled wearily. "It's a lot, but we're making progress. Slowly." Mr. Edwards stepped inside, his tone thoughtful. "Change is always slow, especially when it challenges entrenched systems. But don't underestimate the impact you're having. I've been hearing from staff who say they feel seen and heard for the first time." Angela's chest tightened with a mix of pride and humility. "That means a lot," she admitted, "but there's still so much to do." "And you'll do it, Mr. Ueda," Edwards said with quiet confidence. "You've already shown that you're more than capable." The turning point came 6 months into Angela's tenure as council leader, during a town hall meeting attended by hospital staff, board members, and community leaders. Angela stood at the podium, addressing a packed auditorium. "This journey has not been easy," she began, her voice clear and unwavering. "We've faced resistance, skepticism, and difficult truths. But we've also seen growth, courage, and a willingness to change. That's what gives me hope for the future of this hospital." She highlighted the council's accomplishments: a significant decrease in reported incidents of discrimination, improved staff morale, and positive feedback from patients who appreciated the hospital's renewed commitment to inclusivity. As she concluded her speech, the room erupted into applause. Angela scanned the audience, her eyes landing on Mr. Edwards, who nodded approvingly. After the meeting, several staff members approached Angela, expressing gratitude and sharing their own experiences. Among them was the senior nurse who had been skeptical during that tense meeting months earlier. "I wanted to thank you," the nurse said, her voice sincere. "I didn't understand at first, but you've made a real difference here. We all have a lot to learn, and I'm grateful you're leading the way." Angela felt a lump rise in her throat. "Thank you," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "That means more than you know." By the time the 1-year anniversary of Mr. Edwards's fateful stay at St. Mary's arrived, the hospital had become a model of inclusivity and collaboration. Angela's leadership had transformed not only the institution, but also the lives of countless staff members and patients. As she walked through the bustling halls one evening, Angela paused to admire a new mural in the lobby. It depicted healthcare workers of diverse backgrounds working together, their expressions united by compassion and determination. Below the mural, a plaque read, "Inclusion transforms lives. Unity builds strength." Angela smiled, her heart full. The journey had been long and challenging, but it had been worth every moment.